The Chinese War of Resistance against Japan, 1937 to 1945, was a war of national liberation in which the Chinese people resisted Japanese aggression. The war lasted 8 years, involved hundreds of millions of Chinese people, and made significant contributions to the world anti-fascist war. According to statistics, there were a total of 35 million Chinese casualties during the war, of which military casualties amounted to about 3.8 million and civilian casualties amounted to more than 30 million. The war of resistance against Japan is generally divided into three main phases: the phase of localized resistance, the phase of national resistance, and the phase of strategic counteroffensive. 1. Background and localized war of resistance, 1931 to 1937. The cause of the war of resistance against Japan can be traced back to the beginning of the 20th century, when Japan began to intensify its aggression against China after the Sino-Japanese War. Japan gradually expanded its power in China through a series of wars, treaties, and the occupation of the northeastern part of China. The September 18th incident, 1931, steers. On September 18th, 1931, the Japanese Kuomintang Army created an explosion near Shenhan as an excuse to invade the northeastern region of China. This event marked the beginning of Japan's total invasion of China. Establishment of the Pseudo-Manchukuo, 1932, Psalms. Japan established the Pseudo-Manchukuo in the northeast China with the last emperor Puri as the puppet emperor, thus turning the northeast China into a Japanese colony. China's localized war of resistance starts. After the September 18th incident, all sectors of Chinese society launched anti-Japanese national salvation movements, but due to China's weak military power at that time, the government adopted the policy of non-resistance. Although the Northeastern Army and some civilian armies put up localized resistance, it was difficult to effectively stop the Japanese invasion under the strong pressure of the Japanese army. 2. Outbreak of the Total War of Resistance, 1937-1941. The Lugu Bridge incident of July 7, 1937 became the trigger of the all-out war of resistance. With the occurrence of this incident, the all-out war between China and Japan began. The Lugu Bridge incident fights on July 7, 1937, the Japanese army attacked the Lugu Bridge outside Beijing on the pretext of a drill. After this event, a consensus was formed throughout China to unify against Japan. The national government declared war and the whole country entered a state of war. Battle of Songhu Choris. The Battle of Songhu, which broke out from August to November 1937, was China's first large-scale war of resistance, in which the Kuomintang army assembled a large number of elite troops to resist the Japanese in the Shanghai area. Although the Japanese eventually captured Shanghai, the Battle of Songhu cost the Japanese a great deal of money and held back a large number of Japanese troops. Nanking massacred us on December 13, 1937. The Japanese captured Nanking and carried out a 6-week-long massacre that resulted in the deaths of about 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. The Nanjing Massacre became one of the most brutal war crimes of World War II, triggering international condemnation. Nationalist-Communist Cooperation Dialogues. After the outbreak of the War of Resistance, the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang agreed to jointly resist Japanese aggression. The 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army, led by the Communist Party, went deep into the rear of the enemy, established base areas, and carried out guerrilla warfare, forming the rear battlefield and effectively restrained the Japanese troops. Holding stage 1941 and 1944. Beginning in 1941, the anti-Japanese war entered a phase of stalemate. During this phase, the Chinese people persisted in the war under extremely difficult conditions. Outbreak of the Pacific War starts on December 7, 1941. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War broke out. The United States, Britain, and other countries declared war on Japan, and the war of resistance against Japan became part of the world anti-fascist war. Guerrilla warfare behind enemy line steers. The 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army, under the leadership of the Communist Party, actively carried out guerrilla warfare, destroying the Japanese rear lines of communication, fighting against the counterfeit army, establishing anti-Japanese bases, and gradually expanding the influence of the enemy rear battlefield. The Japan's 3 all-as policy seizures, in order to counteract the guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, the Japanese army adopted the 3 all-as policy of burn all, kill all, loot all against the base areas in an attempt to destroy the Chinese anti-Japanese forces through violent means. The Japanese army adopted the Japan's three eldest policy against the base areas, trying to destroy the Chinese anti-Japanese forces by violent means. However, this deepened the hatred of the Chinese people towards the Japanese army and further inspired their determination to fight against the Japanese. For strategic counteroffensive 1944 to 1945. As World War II entered the late stage, Japan was losing ground in the Pacific theater, and in 1944, the Chinese anti-Japanese forces launched a counteroffensive to gradually regain the lost ground. The Battle of Yuzhong-Guises in the spring of 1944. The Japanese launched the Continental Opening Campaign in an attempt to open up the lines of communication between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. Although the Japanese made progress for a while, they eventually failed due to the stubborn resistance of the Chinese army and the overconsumption of supplies. Allied counteroffensive in China theater circles. The U.S. Army helped China build up its air force and bomb Japanese lines of communication and rare target. In addition, the U.S. provided China with a large amount of military assistance, which enabled China to replenish its equipment and supplies and strengthened its resistance forces. Counteroffensive in the Liberated Areas Acts. The 8th Route Army and the New 4th Army, under the leadership of the Communist Party, launched extensive counteroffensives in the rear battlefields of the enemy, recovered a large number of fallen areas, and further weakened the fighting strength of the Japanese army. 5. Victory in the War of Resistance and Surrender of Japan, 1945. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, and on August 9th, the Soviet Union sent troops to northeast China, crushing Japan's power in China. On August 15th, Japan declared its unconditional surrender, and China's war of resistance against Japanese aggression came to a victorious end. Surrender ceremony Sayos on September 1945, the surrender ceremony of the Chinese war zone, was held in Nanjing, marking the official end of Japan's invasion of China. The victory of the war of resistance against Japan not only liberated China, but also inspired the anti-colonial independence struggles of other Asian countries and nations. 6. Impact and significance of the war of resistance against Japan. National liberation and national sovereignty source. The victory of the war of resistance against Japan freed China from Japanese colonial rule and defended its national independence, laying the foundation for China's development. Growth of the power of the Communist Party of China Sans. During the war of resistance, the CPCA developed rapidly in the base areas behind enemy lines and accumulated rich experience in war, laying the foundation for the subsequent war of liberation. Enhancement of international status. China became one of the main members of the Anti-fascist alliance and had an important position in the post-war international system. China became a founding member of the United Nations and one of the permanent members of the Security Council after the war. Encouragement of anti-colonial movements in Asia. The victory in the anti-Japanese war inspired national independence movements in other parts of Asia and contributed to the rise of the global anti-colonial wave. The war of resistance against Japan was a great victory for the Chinese nation in uniting against the enemy and resisting foreign insults, and demonstrated the indomitable national spirit of the Chinese people and their determination to defend national sovereignty. The war laid the foundation for China's independence and modernization transformation and had a profound impact on Chinese and even world history.